I never thought that putting up an ice fishing shelter on my own property in Duluth, Minnesota, would turn into the battle of the century. But here I was, sitting across from Brenda Hutchins, the president of the Lakeside Commons Homeowners Association, who looked like she had just discovered I was running a meth lab instead of trying to enjoy some winter fishing. My name is Derek Miller, and I had moved into this upscale neighborhood overlooking Lake Superior about 8 months ago. The house was perfect, the view was spectacular, and the location gave me easy access to some of the best ice fishing in the Midwest. I thought I had found paradise. That was before I met Brenda. "Mr. Miller, I don't think you understand the severity of this situation," Brenda said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that only comes from years of making other people's lives miserable over lawn height and fence colors. She was probably in her mid-50s, with that specific haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," and oversized glasses that magnified her judgmental stare. "Your ice fishing shelter is in direct violation of Section 4.7 of our HOA covenant, which clearly states that no temporary structures may be erected on residential properties without prior approval." I leaned back in my chair, trying to keep my cool. "Brenda, it's an ice fishing shelter. I put it up 3 days ago. Ice fishing season just started, and I plan to take it down when the ice melts in spring. It's not like I built a permanent addition to my house. Temporary or not, it's unsightly, it decreases property values, and it violates our community standards," she replied, shuffling through a stack of papers that I assumed were complaints from my neighbors. "I've received 7 formal complaints already. 7 complaints in 3 days. That had to be some kind of record." I looked around the small HOA office, located in the community center building near the entrance of our neighborhood. The walls were covered with notices about upcoming meetings, approved paint colors for exterior home renovations, and a large map of the neighborhood with various properties marked with colored pins. I noticed my property had a red pin. "Probably not a good sign. Who complained?" I asked. "That information is confidential," Brenda said, which I interpreted as meaning she probably filed most of the complaints herself under different names. "Look, I checked the covenants before I put it up. There's nothing specifically about ice fishing shelters. Section 4.7 talks about sheds and permanent outbuildings. This is neither." Brenda's face turned a shade of red that matched the pin on my property on the map. "Mr. Miller, I have been the president of this HOA for 12 years. I know these covenants inside and out. Your structure is a violation, and I am giving you 48 hours to remove it, or we will begin fining you $100 per day until it's gone." I felt my jaw clench. $100 a day. That was aggressive even by HOA standards. "You're serious about this?" "Deadly serious. This is a premier neighborhood, Mr. Miller. We have standards to maintain. When people drive by and see that ridiculous orange tent on your property, it looks like a homeless encampment. It's unacceptable." I stood up, done with this conversation. "I'll see you in 48 hours then, Brenda." "Because that shelter is staying put," her eyes narrowed. "Then I'll see you in court, Mr. Miller. Good day." I walked out of that office steaming. The ice fishing shelter in question was a perfectly reasonable 8 by 8 foot pop-up shelter that I had purchased from a sporting goods store for $600. It was bright orange for safety reasons, well-maintained, and positioned on the far corner of my 2-acre property near the slope that led down to the lake. You could barely see it from the street unless you were specifically looking for it. When I got home, I walked around to the back of my property where the shelter stood. It was a beautiful December afternoon, and the ice on Lake Superior was already thick enough for fishing in certain areas. My shelter sat on the snowy ground, ready to be dragged down to my favorite fishing spot once the ice conditions were perfect. I had been ice fishing since I was a kid growing up in northern Wisconsin, and it was one of my favorite winter activities. The idea that some HOA president could stop me from keeping my equipment on my own property was infuriating. My phone rang. It was my buddy Carson Wheeler, who I had met at a local bar a few months after moving to Duluth. "Hey, Derek, you still getting hassled by the HOA?" Carson asked. "How did you hear about that already?" "Dude, this is Lakeside Commons. Everyone knows everything. My girlfriend's sister lives 3 houses down from you, and apparently the HOA sent out a mass email about unsightly temporary structures without naming names. But everyone knows it's about your ice fishing shelter. You have got to be kidding me." "Nope. Brenda doesn't mess around. She once fined a guy $2,000 because he planted roses that were the wrong shade of red. He ended up selling his house and moving." I sat down on my back porch steps, looking at the shelter. "What am I supposed to do, Carson? I'm not backing down on this. It's ridiculous." "Well, you could take it down and avoid the fines." "Not happening." "Then you better lawyer up, because Brenda has sued homeowners before, and she's won most of the time. The HOA covenants are pretty ironclad, and she's got the whole board in her pocket." After I hung up with Carson, I spent the next few hours researching HOA laws in Minnesota and reading through every page of the Lakeside Commons covenants and bylaws. Carson was right that the rules were extensive, but I was also right that there was no specific mention of ice fishing shelters. Section 4.7 prohibited permanent or semi-permanent accessory structures including but not limited to storage sheds, gazebos, and detached garages without prior architectural approval. The key words were permanent or semi-permanent. My ice fishing shelter was completely temporary and seasonal. That's when the idea hit me. If they wanted to play word games, I could play word games too. I grabbed my laptop and started drafting a letter to the HOA. If my ice fishing shelter was problematic, then I would simply call it something else, something that the covenants didn't prohibit. The next morning, I printed out my letter and drove it over to the HOA office. Brenda was there, of course, probably lying in wait for her next victim. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression was somewhere between surprised and annoyed. "Mr. Miller, I trust you're here to inform me that you've removed the structure." "Actually, no. I'm here to submit a formal clarification about the structure on my property." I handed her the letter. She took it with 2 fingers like it might be contaminated and began reading. I watched her face go from smug to confused to angry in about 30 seconds. "A seasonal storage unit," she said, looking up at me. "You're calling your ice fishing shelter a seasonal storage unit." "That's correct." After reviewing the covenants more carefully, I noticed that Section 6.3 allows for seasonal storage of recreational equipment and vehicles, including boats, RVs, and related accessories, from November through April. My seasonal storage unit is being used to store my ice fishing equipment during the winter months. It's no different than someone keeping a boat in their driveway under a tarp. This is absurd. It's clearly an ice fishing shelter, not a storage unit. It's a structure I'm using to store my ice fishing equipment. That makes it a storage unit, a seasonal one, which is permitted under Section 6.3. Brenda's face was turning that angry red color again. "You can't just rename something and pretend it's different." "Sure I can." If someone asked you what the difference is between a seasonal storage unit and an ice fishing shelter, what would you say? They're both temporary structures used to store equipment. The only difference is the name and how I choose to use it. Right now, I'm using it to store my fishing gear, my portable heater, my auger, and my tackle boxes. That's storage." She stood up, slamming her hand on the desk. "I will not be made a fool of, Mr. Miller. This is a transparent attempt to circumvent the rules." "No, this is me following the rules. You said my ice fishing shelter violated Section 4.7. I've informed you that what you're calling an ice fishing shelter is actually a seasonal storage unit, which is permitted under Section 6.3. If you have a problem with that, you'll need to prove that my interpretation is incorrect." I left the office feeling pretty good about myself. The look on Brenda's face had been worth the price of admission. But I knew this wasn't over. People like Brenda Hutchins didn't back down easily. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice of violation and a fine schedule. They were hitting me with $100 per day starting immediately. The letter stated that my so-called seasonal storage unit was really an ice fishing shelter and therefore violated Section 4.7. They also claimed that even if it was a storage unit, it violated the aesthetic standards of the community because it was orange and visible from certain angles. I called the only attorney I knew in Duluth, a guy named Frank Morrison who had handled my house closing. Frank was in his 60s, semi-retired, and had lived in Duluth his whole life. He listened to my story and actually laughed. "You called it a seasonal storage unit." "That's pretty clever, Derek. Thanks, but now they're fining me $100 a day. Can they do that?" "Well, they can fine you, sure. Whether those fines will hold up is another question. HOAs have a lot of power in Minnesota, but they're not unlimited. If you can make a reasonable argument that your structure complies with the covenants, you've got a fighting chance. But it's going to cost you money to fight this, probably more than the fines in the short term." "How much are we talking?" "I'd need to review all the documents, research some case law, maybe attend a board meeting or two. We're probably looking at $3,000 to $5,000 minimum if this goes to a hearing or mediation. More if it goes to actual court." I thought about it. The principle of the thing was important to me, but was it $5,000 important? Then I thought about Brenda's smug face and the idea of letting her win, and I made my decision. Let's do it. I want to fight this. Frank agreed to take my case, and over the next week, he put together a formal response to the HOA. The response argued that my seasonal storage unit was permitted under Section 6.3, that the structure was temporary and would be removed at the end of ice fishing season, and that the HOA's interpretation of Section 4.7 was overly broad and unreasonable. He also pointed out that several other homes in the neighborhood had seasonal storage of recreational equipment, including boats and RVs, and that my structure was being treated differently without justification. The HOA board scheduled a hearing for January 15th, about 3 weeks away. In the meantime, the daily fines continued to accumulate. By my calculation, I would be up to about $2,000 in fines by the time of the hearing. During this time, I started to learn more about the politics of Lakeside Commons. It turned out that Brenda Hutchins wasn't just unpopular with me. She had a long history of aggressive enforcement of the HOA rules, often going after homeowners for minor infractions while ignoring similar violations by her friends on the board. Several residents reached out to me after hearing about my situation, sharing their own horror stories. One guy, Tim Brennan, told me that Brenda had fined him $3,000 for painting his front door a color she claimed wasn't on the approved list, even though he had color samples that proved otherwise. Another resident, Jennifer Cole, said that Brenda had tried to force her to remove a vegetable garden from her backyard because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood character, even though the covenants said nothing about gardens. In both cases, the homeowners had eventually backed down because fighting the HOA was expensive and exhausting. But there were also whispers of something more serious. A few residents mentioned that Brenda seemed to have an unusual amount of control over HOA funds, and that the financial reports presented at annual meetings were vague and lacked detail. One former board member, Robert Hayes, told me that he had resigned from the board 2 years ago because Brenda had refused to provide detailed accounting records when he asked questions about certain expenses. She said it was none of my business and that questioning her judgment showed a lack of respect for her leadership, Robert told me over coffee at a local diner. I pushed back, and she made my life hell. She started finding violations on my property, sending me nasty letters, threatening fines. Eventually, I just resigned to get her off my back. Did you report any of this to anyone? I asked. Who would I report it to? She controls the board. The management company they use just does what she tells them, and most homeowners don't want to get involved because they're scared of her. This was starting to sound like more than just an overzealous HOA president. It sounded like potential corruption. But I decided to focus on my immediate problem first. I needed to win the hearing about my seasonal storage unit. The hearing was held in the community center on a cold January evening. The board consisted of 5 members, Brenda as president, plus 4 others who I had never met. Frank accompanied me, and we sat on one side of a long table while the board sat on the other side. There were about 15 other residents in the room, apparently there to watch the show. Brenda called the meeting to order and outlined the complaint against me. She presented photos of my seasonal storage unit, which she repeatedly referred to as an ice fishing shelter, and read from the section of the covenants that she claimed I was violating. She also brought up the fines, which had now reached $2,100. Mr. Miller has shown a blatant disregard for our community standards, Brenda said, addressing the other board members. He believes he can simply rename his ice fishing shelter and call it something else to avoid the rules. This sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow this, what's to stop other residents from putting up tent cities in their yards and calling them storage facilities? Frank stood up when it was our turn to speak. Thank you, Madam President. The HOA's characterization of this situation is misleading. Mr. Miller is not trying to evade the rules. He has carefully reviewed the covenants and determined that his seasonal storage unit complies with Section 6.3. The structure in question is temporary. It's being used to store recreational equipment, and it will be removed at the end of the season. This is no different than a boat under a tarp or an RV parked in a driveway, both of which are common in this neighborhood and permitted under the same section. One of the other board members, a man in his 40s named Greg Patterson, spoke up. But isn't there a difference between a boat in a driveway and a tent structure? The tent is more visible and, frankly, it does look out of place in our neighborhood. Frank was ready for this. Section 6.3 makes no distinction based on visibility or appearance. It simply allows for seasonal storage of recreational equipment. If the board wants to add restrictions based on aesthetics, that would require an amendment to the covenants, which would require a vote of all homeowners. The board cannot simply create new rules on the fly. Brenda cut in, her voice sharp. The covenants give the board discretion to interpret the rules and make judgments about what is and isn't consistent with community standards. We are exercising that discretion. Except that your interpretation is inconsistent, Frank replied. You're allowing some types of seasonal storage while prohibiting others, without any clear standard. That's arbitrary and capricious enforcement, which is not permitted under Minnesota HOA law. The debate went on for another 30 minutes. The board members asked questions. Frank and I answered them, and Brenda tried repeatedly to steer the conversation back to how terrible my seasonal storage unit looked and how it was destroying property values. Finally, Brenda called for a vote on whether my structure violated the covenants. The vote was 4-1 in favor of finding me in violation. Only one board member, a woman named Susan Martinez, voted against the finding. Brenda looked triumphant. "The board has made its decision, Mr. Miller. You have 7 days to remove the structure, or the fines will continue and we will pursue legal action to compel removal." Frank stood up. "We'll be filing an appeal with the district court. This decision is unreasonable and inconsistent with the covenants." As we left the meeting, several residents approached me to express their support. Tim Brennan, the guy who had been fined over his door color, shook my hand. "Good for you for fighting back," he said. "Someone needs to stand up to her." Filing the appeal meant more legal fees, and Frank warned me that it could take months to get a court date. In the meantime, the fines would continue to accumulate. I was looking at thousands of dollars in potential liability, plus the legal costs, but I was committed now. Then something unexpected happened. About a week after the hearing, I received a phone call from Susan Martinez, the board member who had voted in my favor. "Mr. Miller, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the HOA directory. I wanted to talk to you about something, but not on the phone. Could we meet somewhere?" We met at a coffee shop in downtown Duluth the next afternoon. Susan was in her early 50s, a school teacher who had lived in Lakeside Commons for about 5 years. She seemed nervous. "I need to tell you something, but I need you to keep it confidential for now," she said. "I've been on the board for 2 years, and I've been increasingly uncomfortable with how Brenda handles things. She's aggressive, she plays favorites, and she doesn't tolerate any disagreement. But there's something else. I think she might be stealing from the HOA. That got my attention." "Stealing how?" "The HOA collects about $200,000 a year in dues from the 87 homes in our neighborhood. That money is supposed to go toward maintenance, insurance, snow removal, landscaping, and reserves for future repairs. But the financial reports Brenda presents are very vague. They show broad categories of expenses without much detail. Last month I asked for more detailed accounting records and she refused. She said I was questioning her integrity and that the board had always operated on trust. That's what Robert Hayes told me too. He resigned over the same thing." Susan nodded. "I know. I talked to Robert. He thinks Brenda has been overcharging for services and pocketing the difference, or possibly creating fake vendors and billing the HOA for work that was never done. But without access to the detailed records, it's hard to prove. Who has access to the financial records?" "Brenda and the management company. But the management company is run by Brenda's brother-in-law, so they're not exactly going to question her." This was getting interesting. "What do you want me to do?" "I'm going to call for a special meeting of homeowners to remove Brenda from the board and conduct a full financial audit. But I need support from other residents. Based on what happened at your hearing, I think you could help rally people who are fed up with her. Are you willing to help?" I didn't have to think about it long. Absolutely. Over the next 2 weeks, Susan and I worked to organize support for the special meeting. We reached out to every homeowner who had ever had a conflict with Brenda, plus anyone who was concerned about the lack of financial transparency. We created a petition calling for her removal and the audit, and we got 47 signatures, which was more than half of the homeowners in the neighborhood. Brenda tried to block the special meeting, claiming the petition didn't follow proper procedures, but Frank reviewed the bylaws and confirmed that we had done everything correctly. The meeting was scheduled for February 10th. In the meantime, the legal battle over my seasonal storage unit was progressing slowly through the court system. The fines had now reached over $4,000, and Brenda had filed a lawsuit seeking to compel me to remove the structure and pay all accumulated fines plus the HOA's legal fees. Frank filed a counterclaim arguing that the HOA's actions were arbitrary and requesting that the court invalidate the fines. The special meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Lakeside Commons showed up, which apparently had never happened before. The tension in the room was palpable. Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members, looking like she was preparing for war. Susan called the meeting to order and explained the purpose: to vote on removing Brenda as president and conducting a full financial audit of the HOA's accounts. Brenda immediately objected, claiming the meeting was illegitimate and that Susan didn't have the authority to call it. Actually, under Section 9.4 of the bylaws, any homeowner or board member can call a special meeting with a petition signed by at least 40% of homeowners, Susan said calmly. We have 54%. This meeting is legitimate. Brenda's face was red. This is a coup. You people are trying to overthrow the board because you don't like the rules. I have given 12 years of my life to this community, and this is the thanks I get. This isn't about the rules, Brenda, Susan replied. This is about accountability and transparency. Multiple homeowners have requested detailed financial records, and you've refused to provide them. That's not acceptable. Several homeowners stood up to speak. Robert Hayes talked about his experience on the board and Brenda's refusal to provide accounting details. Tim Brennan talked about the arbitrary enforcement of rules. Jennifer Cole described how Brenda had harassed her over the vegetable garden. One by one, residents shared their stories, and a picture emerged of a president who had become a tyrant. Then someone in the back stood up. It was a woman I didn't recognize, probably in her 30s. I'm Patricia Thompson. I used to work for Lakeside Management Services, the company that manages this HOA. I quit 6 months ago because I couldn't stomach what was going on anymore. The room went silent. Brenda looked like she had seen a ghost. What do you mean? Susan asked. Patricia took a breath. Brenda Hutchins has been billing the HOA for services that were never provided. Phantom landscaping work, inflated maintenance costs, fake legal fees. I saw the invoices. I questioned them, and she told me to mind my own business. When I kept pushing, she had her brother-in-law fire me. I estimate she's stolen at least $50,000 over the past 3 years, probably more. The room erupted. Everyone was talking at once. Brenda stood up, her face white. That's slander. I'll sue you for every penny you have. It's not slander if it's true, Patricia said. And I kept copies of all the documents before they fired me. I've been waiting for the right time to come forward, and this seems like it. Susan looked at Patricia. Would you be willing to turn those documents over for an independent audit? Absolutely. The vote was held immediately after that. 71 homeowners voted to remove Brenda from the board and conduct a full financial audit. Only 3 voted against it, and I suspected those were Brenda's friends. Brenda stormed out of the meeting, but not before shouting that we would all regret this and that her lawyers would be in touch. The board appointed an interim president and hired an independent accounting firm to conduct the audit. Patricia Thompson turned over her documents, which included invoices, payment records, and emails between Brenda and her brother-in-law discussing how to hide certain expenses. The audit took 3 weeks. When the results came back, they were worse than anyone had expected. Brenda had systematically embezzled approximately $93,000 over a 4-year period. She had used a variety of methods: fake vendors, inflated invoices, unauthorized reimbursements for personal expenses, and kickbacks from service providers who overcharged the HOA and split the difference with her. The board filed a police report with the Duluth Police Department. Detective Maria Sanchez was assigned to the case. She reviewed the audit results and Patricia's documents, interviewed board members and residents, and concluded that there was sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. Brenda was arrested on March 8th at her home. She was charged with multiple counts of theft by swindle and financial exploitation, which were felonies under Minnesota law. The local news covered the story, and it became a minor scandal in Duluth. The headline in the Duluth News-Tribune read, "HOA president arrested for embezzling nearly $100,000 from neighborhood association." As for my seasonal storage unit, the interim board voted unanimously to drop all fines and legal actions against me. They also voted to amend the covenants to clearly allow seasonal storage of ice fishing equipment and shelters, as long as they were removed by May 1st each year. My legal battle was over, and I had won. Frank submitted a final bill for his services, $8,000, which covered all the hearings, filings, research, and the appeal that was ultimately dropped. The new board voted to have the HOA reimburse me for those fees as a gesture of goodwill and an acknowledgement that the previous enforcement action had been improper. I was relieved, both financially and emotionally. The criminal case against Brenda moved through the court system over the following months. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in going easy. The evidence was overwhelming, and the amount of money involved was too large to dismiss as a simple mistake or misunderstanding. The trial was held in October at the St. Louis County District Court in Duluth. I attended several days of the proceedings, partly out of curiosity and partly because I had been subpoenaed as a witness to testify about the HOA's operations and the lack of financial transparency. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: bank records, invoices, emails, testimony from Patricia Thompson, and the independent audit report. The defense tried to argue that Brenda had made accounting errors, but had never intended to steal, which was a tough sell given the sophistication of the schemes she had used. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of deliberations, the jury found Brenda guilty on 7 counts of theft by swindle and 2 counts of financial exploitation. The judge scheduled sentencing for December. At the sentencing hearing, several residents of Lakeside Commons gave victim impact statements. Susan Martinez talked about how Brenda's actions had violated the trust of the community and stolen money that was meant for maintaining and improving the neighborhood. Robert Hayes described how Brenda had used her position to bully and intimidate residents who questioned her authority. Tim Brennan talked about the arbitrary fines and enforcement actions that had been designed to punish people who stood up to her. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. I moved to Lakeside Commons because it seemed like a great place to live. Instead, I found myself in a battle over an ice fishing shelter, which led to thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. I now know that my situation was just a symptom of a larger problem: a president who believed she was above the rules and accountable to no one. I hope the court will send a message that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. The judge sentenced Brenda to 5 years in prison, with credit for time served, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, which meant returning the $93,000 plus interest and penalties, bringing the total to over $110,000. The judge said that people in positions of trust who abuse that trust for personal gain deserve serious consequences. Brenda's brother-in-law, who ran the management company, was also charged with being an accessory to theft. He ultimately pleaded guilty and received 2 years in prison plus restitution obligations. By the time everything was resolved, it was December again, almost exactly 1 year since I had first put up my seasonal storage unit and triggered this whole chain of events. The ice on Lake Superior was forming again, and I was getting ready for another season of ice fishing. The new HOA board was functioning well. Susan Martinez had been elected president, and she had brought in several other residents who were committed to transparency and reasonable enforcement of the rules. They published detailed monthly financial reports, hired a reputable management company that wasn't related to any board members, and created a formal process for handling complaints and violations that included appeal rights and proportional penalties. The neighborhood felt different now. People were more engaged, there were more social events, and there was a sense of community that hadn't existed when everyone was afraid of Brenda. Several residents told me that they were glad I had fought back, because it had exposed the corruption and ultimately made Lakeside Commons a better place to live. I took my seasonal storage unit down to my favorite fishing spot on Lake Superior in mid-December, once the ice was thick enough. Carson came with me, along with a few other guys from the neighborhood who had become friends during the whole ordeal. We spent a cold but satisfying afternoon catching lake trout and northern pike, drinking coffee from thermoses, and telling stories. "You know, Derek, when you moved here, I bet you didn't think you'd end up taking down a corrupt HOA president," Carson said, laughing. "That's for sure. I just wanted to go ice fishing." "Well, you did more than that. You changed this whole neighborhood." He was right, though it hadn't been my intention. I had just wanted to exercise my rights as a homeowner and enjoy my property without unreasonable interference. But sometimes standing up for yourself has bigger consequences than you expect. As the sun started to set over Lake Superior, painting the ice in shades of orange and pink, I thought about everything that had happened. The legal battles, the hearings, the fines, the discovery of embezzlement, the trial, and finally the justice that had been served. It had been exhausting and expensive, even with the reimbursement, but it had been worth it. The orange ice fishing shelter, my trusty seasonal storage unit, sat on the ice next to me, keeping my gear organized and protected from the wind. It was just a piece of equipment, a simple pop-up tent designed for outdoor recreation. But it had become a symbol of something larger, the right to use your own property as you see fit, as long as you're not harming anyone else. I pulled in another fish, a nice-sized lake trout, and added it to the cooler. Life was good. The fish were biting, the neighborhood was in good hands, and Brenda Hutchins was in prison where she belonged. Sometimes justice does prevail, even against an HOA. Over the following months, I became more involved in the Lakeside Commons community. I attended board meetings, volunteered for neighborhood events, and even joined a committee to review and update the covenants to make them more reasonable and clear. We removed a lot of the vague language that Brenda had used to justify arbitrary enforcement, and we added protections for homeowners facing violation claims. One of the changes we made was to create an independent appeals process for anyone who disagreed with a board decision. Instead of appealing to the same board that made the initial decision, homeowners could now request mediation with a neutral third party. This gave people a fair shot at challenging unreasonable enforcement without having to hire a lawyer and go to court. We also implemented term limits for board members and required annual financial audits by an independent accounting firm. These changes were designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power and to ensure that the HOA's finances remained transparent and accountable. The response from residents was overwhelmingly positive. People felt like they finally had a voice in how the neighborhood was run, and there was a renewed sense of pride in Lakeside Commons. Property values actually increased, which was ironic considering that Brenda had always claimed that my seasonal storage unit was destroying property values. In February, I received a letter from the Minnesota Department of Commerce. They had been investigating HOA abuses across the state after a series of high-profile cases, including ours, had highlighted the potential for corruption and overreach. The department was proposing new regulations that would require all HOAs to register with the state, submit annual financial reports, and follow standardized procedures for enforcement actions and appeals. The letter asked if I would be willing to testify at a legislative hearing about my experience with Lakeside Commons and the importance of HOA reform. I agreed immediately. If my story could help prevent other homeowners from going through what I had gone through, it was worth the time and effort. The hearing was held at the Minnesota State Capitol in St. Paul in March. I drove down with Susan Martinez and Robert Hayes, and we all testified before a committee of state senators and representatives. I told them about the battle over my ice fishing shelter, the arbitrary fines, the lack of financial transparency, and the eventual discovery of embezzlement. The problem isn't just about bad people like Brenda Hutchins, I said in my testimony. The problem is a system that gives HOA boards too much power with too little oversight. Most board members are well-intentioned volunteers trying to help their communities. But without proper checks and balances, even good people can make bad decisions, and bad people can cause serious harm. The committee members asked thoughtful questions about what reforms would be most helpful. I suggested mandatory financial audits, standardized enforcement procedures, appeal rights, and a state agency that could investigate complaints about HOA misconduct. Several other homeowners from around Minnesota testified with similar stories and recommendations. The bill that eventually passed wasn't perfect, but it was a significant improvement. It required annual financial audits for any HOA with more than 25 homes, created a standardized notice and hearing process for enforcement actions, gave homeowners the right to appeal to an independent arbitrator, and established an HOA ombudsman within the Department of Commerce to investigate complaints and mediate disputes. The governor signed the bill into law in May, and it was scheduled to take effect on January 1st of the following year. Several news articles credited the Lakeside Commons case with spurring the reforms, and I received thank you notes from homeowners across the state who were struggling with their own HOA problems. By the time summer arrived, things had settled into a comfortable routine. My legal battles were over, the HOA was functioning well, and I had become something of a minor local celebrity as the guy who took on a corrupt HOA and won. People occasionally recognized me at the grocery store or the hardware store and wanted to shake my hand or thank me for what I had done. I tried to stay humble about it. I hadn't set out to be an activist or a reformer. I had just wanted to go ice fishing without being hassled by an overzealous HOA president. But sometimes one person standing up for what's right can make a difference. Carson and I took his boat out on Lake Superior one sunny afternoon in July. As we trolled for salmon, he brought up something I had been thinking about. "You know, Derek, you should write a book about all this. I bet a lot of people would be interested in the story." "Maybe," I said. "But who has time to write a book? I'm too busy living my life and enjoying my house." "Fair enough. But seriously, You did something important. You took on a bully, exposed corruption, and helped change the laws to protect other people. That's pretty impressive. I thought about Brenda sitting in prison, about the $93,000 she had stolen and would have to repay, about all the residents she had bullied and intimidated over the years. I thought about Patricia Thompson, who had risked her job to do the right thing. I thought about Susan Martinez and Robert Hayes, who had stood up even when it was uncomfortable and difficult. And I thought about all the homeowners who had supported the special meeting and voted to hold Brenda accountable. It wasn't just me, I said. It was a lot of people working together. That's what made the difference. Sure, but you were the catalyst. If you had just backed down and taken down your ice fishing shelter, none of this would have happened. Brenda would still be stealing, Patricia would still be afraid to come forward, and the neighborhood would still be miserable. He had a point. My decision to fight back, even when it seemed expensive and risky, had set everything else in motion. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones where we refuse to accept injustice, even when it would be easier to just go along. The following winter, I put up my seasonal storage unit again, right on schedule. This time there were no complaints, no fines, and no letters from the HOA. Several of my neighbors had actually gotten their own ice fishing shelters, and we had formed an informal club. Every weekend during ice fishing season, a group of us would head out to the lake together, set up our shelters in a cluster, and spend the day fishing and socializing. It became one of the highlights of my year. There's something special about sitting on the ice, fishing rod in hand, surrounded by friends, with nothing to worry about except whether the fish are biting. The simplicity and peace of it reminded me why I had fought so hard to protect this simple pleasure. On the anniversary of my first hearing with the HOA board, Susan organized a neighborhood party to celebrate the progress we had made. It was held at the community center, the same place where I had faced off against Brenda a year earlier. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Instead of tension and conflict, there was laughter and camaraderie. Instead of fear and resentment, there was pride and community spirit. Susan gave a short speech thanking everyone who had helped transform Lakeside Commons. A year ago, this neighborhood was a very different place. We were divided, afraid, and oppressed by a board that had lost sight of its purpose. Today, we're united, empowered, and proud of what we've accomplished together. We owe a special thanks to Derek Miller, whose courage and persistence sparked the changes that have made this possible. Everyone applauded, and I felt a little embarrassed but also grateful. These were good people, and this was a good place to live. It had taken a fight to make it that way, but it had been worth it. Later that evening, as I walked home through the snow-covered streets of Lakeside Commons, I looked at the houses around me. Lights glowed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and snow blanketed the lawns in pristine white. It looked like a postcard of an ideal American neighborhood. And for the first time since I had moved here, it felt like one too. The corruption was gone, the tyrant was in prison, and the community was thriving. We had taken something broken and fixed it, not by ignoring the problems but by confronting them head-on. I thought about all the HOAs across America, all the homeowners dealing with arbitrary rules and power-hungry board members. I hoped that the reforms we had helped pass would make a difference for them. I hoped that other people would be inspired to stand up for their rights, to demand accountability, and to refuse to be intimidated by bullies with a little bit of authority. When I got home, I made a cup of hot chocolate and sat by my back window, looking out at where my seasonal storage unit would soon be stationed for another winter. That little orange tent had caused quite a controversy, but it had also been the catalyst for real change. I raised my mug in a silent toast to seasonal storage units everywhere, to ice fishing shelters that refuse to be banned, and to homeowners who won't back down from a fight. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance lead to the biggest victories. The next morning, I got a call from Frank Morrison, my attorney. "Derek, I wanted to let you know that Brenda's restitution payments have started coming through. The HOA has received the first installment, about $15,000. She's going to be making payments for the rest of her life, but at least the money is starting to come back. That's good news. What's the HOA going to do with it? The board is setting up a reserve fund for major repairs and improvements. They're also planning to reduce next year's dues by about 20% since they'll have more money in the budget. Susan wanted me to thank you again. She said none of this would have happened without you." After I hung up, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, the money was being recovered, and the community was better off. It was as close to a happy ending as you could get in a situation like this. Over the next few months, I focused on enjoying my life in Duluth. I went ice fishing regularly, spent time with friends, and stayed involved with the HOA in a positive way. The drama and conflict of the previous year faded into memory, replaced by the normal rhythms of everyday life. But I never forgot the lessons I had learned. I learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's difficult and expensive. I learned that one person really can make a difference if they are willing to persist. I learned that corruption thrives in darkness, but withers in the light of transparency. And I learned that communities are strongest when everyone has a voice and when power is held accountable. Those lessons stayed with me, shaping how I approached not just HOA issues but everything in life. When I saw injustice, I spoke up. When I saw someone being bullied, I intervened. When I saw corruption, I exposed it. Because I had learned that silence and compliance only make things worse, while courage and action can change the world. Years later, when people ask me about the whole ice fishing shelter controversy, I would smile and give them the short version. I put up an ice fishing shelter. The HOA said I couldn't. I called it a seasonal storage unit. They tried to fine me. I fought back. We discovered the president was embezzling. She went to prison, and we reformed the whole system. They usually laughed at how absurd it sounded when compressed into one sentence. But it was all true. Every ridiculous, frustrating, ultimately triumphant bit of it. My seasonal storage unit became a permanent fixture every winter, a bright orange reminder of what one person could accomplish by refusing to back down. And every time I walked past it, I felt a surge of pride. Not pride in having won a battle, but pride in having stood up for what was right. Lakeside Commons thrived under its new leadership. The neighborhood won awards for community engagement and financial transparency. Property values continued to rise. New families moved in, attracted by the reputation of a well-run HOA that treated residents fairly and operated with integrity. And somewhere in a Minnesota prison, Brenda Hutchins served her sentence, probably still fuming about the ice fishing shelter that had brought her empire crashing down. I didn't waste much energy thinking about her. She had made her choices, and she was facing the consequences. My focus was on the future, not the past. The ice fishing club that had formed in the neighborhood grew to over 20 members. We had people of all ages and backgrounds, united by a love of the sport and the camaraderie it fostered. Some winter Saturdays, we'd have a dozen shelters clustered together on the ice, creating a temporary village of orange tents. Kids would run between the shelters, adults would share stories and food, and everyone would be out there enjoying the beautiful Minnesota winter. That's what it was always supposed to be about. Not rules and regulations and fines and power trips, just people enjoying their homes, their hobbies, and their community. It had taken a fight to get there, but we had arrived. As I sat in my seasonal storage unit on a cold February morning, watching my fishing line disappear into the dark water below the ice, I reflected on everything that had changed. A simple desire to go ice fishing had sparked a chain of events that exposed corruption, reformed laws, and transformed a neighborhood. It was more than I could have ever imagined when I first moved to Lakeside Commons, but that's how change happens sometimes. Not through grand plans or elaborate schemes, but through ordinary people doing ordinary things and refusing to accept injustice when they encounter it. My seasonal storage unit wasn't just a place to store my fishing gear. It was a symbol of resistance, of standing up for your rights, and of the power of community action. And when spring came and I packed up the shelter for the season, I did so knowing that it would be back next winter, just like always. Because some things are worth fighting for, and some principles are worth defending, no matter what some HOA president thinks. That little orange tent had become part of my identity, part of my story, and part of the larger narrative of Lakeside Commons. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of defiance can have far-reaching consequences when it's backed by courage, persistence, and a commitment to doing what's right. The story of my seasonal storage unit would be told for years to come, passed down to new residents as a legend of how the neighborhood had been transformed. And every time someone put up their own ice fishing shelter without fear of harassment or fines, they would be living proof that the fight had been worth it. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for: to leave things a little better than we found them, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, and to create a community where everyone can pursue their happiness without unreasonable interference. My seasonal storage unit had helped make that possible, one winter season at a time. And as I drove home from the lake that day, my truck loaded with fishing gear and a cooler full of fresh-caught trout, I couldn't help but smile. Life in Duluth was good. The neighborhood was good. And my seasonal storage unit would be back next year, standing proud as a testament to the principle that homeowners deserve to be treated fairly, and that corruption can be defeated when people work together. That was the real victory, the one that mattered more than any legal ruling or prison sentence. We had built something better, something stronger, something worth protecting. And it had all started with an ice fishing shelter that I refused to take down. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference.